Hello and welcome. Are you excited? We're going to get into some background information, some ideas for you to consider while you're reading the manga version of King Lear. It's a very different setting and visual adaptation of the play, and I can't wait to hear what you have to say about it. But to give you a little bit of grounding, let's get into an introduction to King Lear and Elizabethan ideologies and taking a glimpse into an age through a play. So let's get started. So first, I'd like you to begin to ponder a few of the really heavy, philosophical, thought-provoking elements and ideas within the play. We're going to get into some super deep thinking, and what's also pretty fascinating is the way that Shakespeare is going to take a very a realism approach before even that literary concept and term was presented, a more realistic approach to the action of the play. So Shakespeare is going to prompt us to consider the indifference of our universe, contemplate human life as meaningless and brutal. He's going to really delve into existentialism here, which is so much fun. He's evoking the wretchedness of the human existence and suffering, and what that can lead to, and that it's not always a bad thing, that we can have self-realization, self-discovery through that. And then this dichotomy between justice and injustice, and whether or not justice prevails, but certainly the appearance of injustice triumphing. I also want you to look at how Shakespeare's play puts a twist on the popular folktale of Cinderella. And so we've got the stepsisters there, and typically the poor Cinderella, who is the stepsister, and essentially the sort of idyllic woman, how typically in Cinderella she comes out on top, but in Shakespeare's play, the Cinderella-esque character does not come out on top. And overall, I want you to consider, is there any retribution for the suffering and injustice in the play? That's something that Shakespeare really toys with for the ancient stories, the mythology, the quote-unquote histories of King Lear all ended happily. And Shakespeare decides to approach the legend of King Lear in a vastly different way. And so I want you to think about, why does Shakespeare provide a tragic ending? What might Shakespeare want to reveal through his hand, or explore, or prompt in his audience by really switching up the conclusion of the play? Here's a little background. So King Lear is thought to have been written in 1605, which is smack dab in the middle of Othello and Macbeth. And we're reading Othello, currently finishing it up, and we're going to be moving to King Lear. And these plays are considered to be when Shakespeare is at his pinnacle of his playwriting prowess, particularly when it comes to the tragedy genre. And so I want you to think about any similarities, since the plays are written so close to one another. Is he carrying through any similar themes, any similar social critiques, any similar political critiques, and what you think about the themes and the plots and the ideas. So we have this legendary mythological king, King Lear, and you can see that often it was spelt L-E-I-R, as it is here. And the first mention of this king is in Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae, in the 12th century. And this is a part of medieval history. This is a part of Geoffrey of Monmouth also wrote some of the Arthurian legends that we've been speaking of in class. So, and this would have been a written form of what was stories that were shared in the oral tradition. And so what you want to consider with this is how much of it is real history, how much of it is sort of mythological, how much of it has become legend and larger than life, into sort of mythology and folklore. And then you can see the list of the other sort of sources where there's mentions of King Lear, or King Lear's history is thought to have been chronicled, and Shakespeare would have been familiar with and exposed to each of these works. And again, Shakespeare does his own thing. He's aware of the history, and then he wants to put his own twist on it and provide sort of an alternate perspective of history, and a sort of what if this happened. Marvel Studios has a whole what if things for the superhero shows, films, and what if this happened. But it's really fascinating that these other accounts of King Lear are pretty similar, particularly with all having happy endings for King Lear and a happy ending for Cordelia. However, Shakespeare chooses to defy the conventions of his sources, and he provides a relentless honesty and a refusal to accept easy answers when it comes to the questions about life, identity, death, justice, familial responsibility, interpersonal relationships, political questions. So a couple of things I want you to be on the lookout for as you're reading and enjoying King Lear. So look for examples of justice and injustice being inverted. Injustice sort of being the norm. Consider the folklore and legend elements that Shakespeare employs. So think about fairy tales, think about mythology, think about folklore, and think about even sort of romance, but not like romance novels, but Arthurian romance, that adventure, all the things we've been talking about with history, tragedy, and even history. So I want you to think about what are the wondrous and implausible circumstances in this play that Shakespeare capitalizes on to tell his story. I want you to also consider how Shakespeare offers an opposition of parable and folklore in lieu of a more realistic approach. So look for the dramatic tension between an idealized world and the make-believe and the actual world of disappointed hopes. I want you to really look for the realistic elements of the play instead of the fantastical, and how Shakespeare is reflecting reality. Keep in mind the artifice and convention that's juxtaposed against the truth of love, suffering, and hatred. As I've already mentioned, there is lots to do with existentialism and self-identity, and it's freaking fantastic. I think you're going to love it. And even though Shakespeare shows how painful it can be, especially if one is filled with too much hubris, always think about what's the tragic flaw, who's the tragic hero or heroine, and what is the cause of their downfall, and what might Shakespeare be trying to reveal to his audience by showing these people of note and their downfall. But even though self-discovery can be painful, Shakespeare also shows the benefits of it, and that there's some sort of compensation at the end. There's lots of paradox in this play, and it's natural, unnatural, all over the place. Familial love and duty, and the opposite of that, right? But I want you to think about how throughout the play, folly and wisdom exchange places, and the characters that particularly Shakespeare's society, but maybe even ours as well, the characters that are considered to be low standing, not as valuable, not as reputable, might have more wisdom. They might have been considered the ones to be more folly or lacking in wisdom, that they have the wisdom, and that those who are elevated and held up in society and considered to be leaders and people of power are subject to folly and maybe lack wisdom that it's expected that they should have. I also want you to consider the following. A lot of scholarly work shows interest in the following areas as pertains to this play. And so I want you to keep some of these ideas in mind as you're reading through and see what strikes you as being interesting or particularly relevant for us today in the 2020s. So, the great chain of being, you've heard me speak to this a little bit in class, and this comes from in the beginning, the Judeo-Christian Bible, Genesis 1:1, and even the story of creation, that certainly, whether they were holding to the Catholic belief or the Protestant belief or following the Anglican Church, but in Elizabethan and even Jacobean England, the society would have understood this concept of a chain of being. And it's a progression of light to water, to earth, to plants, to animals, and finally to human that was set forth in the Judeo-Christian Bible. And it becomes this ladder of intellect. And you might even make connections to Jacob's ladder when in one of the biblical stories that Jacob builds the ladder to try to get to heaven, right? And that's why I like this picture with the staircase, and these are in Latin, but we start with stone to flame to plant to beast to human to heaven to angel to God. And there are categories within each of these larger categories, but each one is their own step, and you want to try to ascend, but you're kind of relegated to your category. But even within these categories, there would be a hierarchy of who would be higher class human and lower class human. And even when we get to the heavenly beings, we have a hierarchy until we get to the Godhead, right? And so this is really important. We've mentioned it briefly, but I want to highlight it again, that for Elizabethan England, there's absolutely a hierarchy spiritually, a hierarchy earthly wise, a hierarchy social and class wise. And so this society is really interested in keeping the order, and that there's an orderly progression upwards. And so this concept of order and its fixed hierarchy were really significant, mainly for both the church and state, meaning the monarchy, to maintain their power. Because if we keep this hierarchical idea in mind, where everybody has his, her, their space, and that there's not too much mobility, then that allows the religious elite, the monarchs, and the aristocracy to maintain their power and their control. So here's another way to look at this, and it's not just for the control, but it's also for harmony. And as we've also mentioned, and we'll talk about this more in the future too, the monarchs, there's a big push and pull between tyranny and treason, and wanting to maintain harmony and order among the citizens so that the monarch can rule peacefully. And so there is, and during this time, Elizabethans praised this concept of order, which they felt led them to harmony. And so you can sort of see the different classifications, and then how we move the different classes, then to the existence or not, living or not, and then when we get to feeling, and then when we move to understanding. And so each of these classes has a progression, with some having everything. And so there's a hierarchy, there's no gap between each classification. We have the inanimate class, water, earth to water. You've got the human beings. This is important when we get to some of the other plays, particularly Richard III, when we have the religious hierarchy and who's in power or not in power, and who can benefit the monarch, the city monarch, so bishop to archbishop. And there's no movement, as I've mentioned before. Now, we've briefly talked about the humors, and the even physicality, and there's a lot of different human traits. And so Elizabethans, as much as they were challenged with their knowledge of medicine and the human body, they also had some pretty advanced notions that carry through today, and might even be connected to some Eastern perspectives, like with the chi and chakras and things like that. But so what we've got, we have one way to look at human beings as being ruled by different elements, and those elements would have different qualities that translate into personality characteristics. The reason I want to bring this forward is because these ideas translate into Shakespeare's characters quite beautifully. He certainly has fire, air, water, earth characters, and they can also sort of be combos of each thing. So when you're looking at the qualities, you've got earth, it's cold and dry, water, cold and moist, air, hot and moist, fire, hot and dry. You've also got the colors associated with it and the symbolism along with it. And we've got the world that's made up of the four elements, but then how we can be a fiery, passionate person, how we can be a little bit more airy in the way that we move through the world, a little more ethereal. We can flow more like the water. We can be grounded like the earth, right? And so I want you to keep these in mind as you look back at Othello, as you look forward to the play King Lear and the rest of the plays we're going to read. Or if we're looking at the romances and the comedies, it takes place in that way as well. But then you've got the substance, the bodily fluids that are produced, and how those relate to the elements, but also to different personality characteristics. So you will hear Shakespeare's characters speak about someone being ruled by their liver, or having a lot of blood, or being bile-like, or their spleen, and they're being ruled by their spleen. And so once again, this lets you know how these substances and the organs that they were associated with relate to the different elements, but then it's also going to relate to the humor. What kind of personality. They'll be choleric, they'll be sanguine, they'll be phlegmatic, they'll be melancholic. And if a character is said to be melancholic, then the thought would be that they had too much black bile, that their gallbladder was over creating, that then created this melancholic perspective. And the same with the blood and the liver. Their blood is too hot, so they're sanguine, or the blood is flowing too much. And then you can see if they're choleric and they're ruled by their spleen, then they're often short-tempered, they're thin, I don't know why they have to pick on the gingers, but they're red-haired, they're ambitious. And then you can see sanguine, optimistic, red-cheeked, corpulent, irresponsible, phlegmatic, sluggish, pallid, corpulent, lazy, cowardly, and then introspective, sallow, and thin for melancholic. And you can think about whatever genre of play we're discussing, tragedy, history, romance, comedy, that you can identify different characters that fit within each of these different categories. So we've got Petruchio from The Taming of the Shrew, Bottom from Midsummer Night's Dream, Angelo, Measure for Measure. We could also see Hamlet definitely being melancholic, Romeo. We could see maybe a Cleopatra being choleric and maybe even sanguine. We could see certainly later in the play Desdemona being rather melancholic, right? So you've got all sorts of things happening there. Another ideology of Elizabethan England that even was a part of Jacobean England was really being connected to the stars. And in many of the plays, you'll hear characters speak about what star are you born under, what planet are you connected to, and this concept of the zodiac, and when you were born, and sort of astrology in this way was something really significant during this time. And so you can see the illustration to the right shows the different signs of the zodiac and the various activities throughout the month. And this is as early as 1485, this image. And what's interesting, we're dealing with very much the binary view of gender, but you've got female and male. But what's kind of exciting is as you move around the zodiac and the activities with the female of summer, love, and passion, and the male winter, thought, and reason, there is a little bit of crossover. But it's also showing these two things in balance, in circular, connected, rather than separate on the binary. So that shows more fluidity between being able to move between the female and the male, which is sort of interesting. And one's dominant sign was thought to influence one's body. So the different signs of the zodiac correspond to the different parts of the body. So I already mentioned this about being born under a certain planet, a certain star, having certain stars at certain times. And there would be a direct correlation to how that planet would then govern the person's personality in some way, shape, or form. So here are the planets. And then here's the influence. And you can see with Venus and Mars and even Jupiter, we're really, and Mercury and Saturn, we're also pulling. Shakespeare goes more to the Roman gods than to the Greek gods. And so there's a direct correlation to Roman mythology. So you can also apply what we know about Mercury being the messenger of the gods, Venus being the goddess of love, Mars being the god of war, Jupiter, Jove being the premier god of gods, and then Saturn, the ancient father god. And then here are the personality traits that are related to the planet's influence, and then the personality traits. So it's a lot of fun too to see that Shakespeare really tries to create well-rounded, human-like characters that we can relate to as audience members. So here's a quotation from King Lear for you to think about as we move forward. Who is it that can tell me who I am? Who said it? When and where? What's the meaning? And I look forward to hearing from you next time.